So, okay, got it.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Well, let's see if I can. Yes. And so working at the nursery was when I was first introduced to Doug Tallamy's book. When it first came out when I was working there. And this book really changed my life. If you haven't already read it, I certainly recommend it. But he also has several updated kind of versions of this book, as well as kind of offshoots from this topic. But Doug Tallamy is an entomologist from the University of Delaware, and he really made the connection between native plants, insects, and birds. And that's what his research has focused on, and why this relationship between native plants, insects, and birds are the basis of life on Earth and supports all of our lives as well, and why it is so critical. I definitely recommend Doug Tallamy. He has a wonderful website, great social media, and he's also very active putting out videos on YouTube, and he gives talks all over, the nation, probably the world, but you can see a lot of those talks on YouTube if you're interested. I definitely recommend checking them out. So 80% of plants in the average yard are non-native, and this is a problem. Culturally, our approach to our yards and gardens has been problematic in some ways. We see our yards as ours, as that we have ownership over them, and that we get to do with them whatever we want, and that's fine. But we have, relatively short lifespans, and what happens after that has had cascading effects on future generations, on us now. What people did to their yards has had effects on us and our native plants and insects and wildlife and birds as well. So it's time for us to begin to look at our yards in a different light. Historically, we approach our gardening and landscaping as an aesthetic, purely for aesthetic values, essentially, and for maintenance, and for portraying to our neighbors that we are responsible, wealthy individuals, right? Well, this yard that we're looking at, which is a pretty typical yard, like in Tallahassee here where I live, is a desert for wildlife and a desert for birds. There's nothing sustaining life here in this yard besides some of those trees that you see in the background there. So it is important for us to begin to view our yards as a piece in a larger whole that plays a functioning role. Our yard is a member of an ecosystem, and it plays a critical role. And as humans' development expands, what we add or remove from our yards becomes increasingly more important. So I think that planting native is aesthetically pleasing. I think it's, in fact, much more aesthetically beautiful to the eye. It's relaxing, it changes with the seasons, and it's dynamic. And you get to enjoy all of the wildlife that native plants bring to your yard. So, but most importantly, these plants are groups that play a functioning role in an ecosystem. And this is what sustains life on Earth. So we have to begin to view our yards as a member of this ecosystem. And I also think, having a native yard, well-maintained yard that is beautiful and functioning is also one of the best legacies you could leave, because we live in a world where, I know personally, I feel very powerless about my ability to change things on a larger scale, that I see, loss of diversity, loss of species, loss of habitat, and it's very, it makes me feel scared and powerless. And making the small changes in our yard has an effect on the greater scale, and it's a wonderful legacy to be able to leave to future generations. So as we lose more and more natural lands to human development, we have become increasingly more important players in the management of our nation's wildlife, because there's less and less natural areas to support them. And so what you add or remove to your yard affects the biodiversity of your yard, your town, and the planet overall. So your actions make a difference, which is a really, I think, empowering message. So native plants are the first level of the food web. And so all energy, all calories come from the sun. And plants are the first level. So plants have the ability to photosynthesize, and they turn the energy from the sun into calories, essentially, for the rest of the world, for us, for wildlife, etc. But there are very few vertebrates that are herbivores that are able to take plants and turn them into, more energy, more protein, more fats and oils, etc., more calories. So what is doing that? Who is playing that role? And that role, how do the sun's energy move up the food chain if there are very few herbivores that can eat and pass that energy along? And you might recognize this tree right here. A lot of people consider it a pest, even though it's a very important native plant that has a very critical role in our ecosystems. This is sweet gum, liquid ambar styracifolium. And lots of people don't like it because those little balls, if you walk barefoot on your driveway, could really mess up your foot. And, you might also sprain your ankle or something, but this is an important plant. And so how does it move energy up the food chain? Well, one way that all of you birders probably know is goldfinches love those sweet gum balls. So as many of you probably know, before you see any goldfinch, you'll probably hear them because they're up in the trees, often around sweet gum, eating those little seeds out of those sweet gum balls. But it's not the seeds and berries that are the most important for birds. It's actually the leaves. Here are some beautiful fall foliage of sweet gum. And why are those leaves so important? Because native insects eat them. And so here is a nice fat, juicy caterpillar of a luna moth, and they eat sweet gum. Many Lepidoptera, the moths and butterflies, they're specialists, so they eat only specific host plants. The adult butterflies or moths only lay their eggs on specific plants. And for luna moths, sweet gum is one of those few plants. So native insects, they are the critical basis, the second level of the food web. They have co-evolved over time with native plants, and they turn green energy, the plants, into protein in the form of themselves for all wildlife. And pound for pound, especially caterpillars are critically important. They contain more protein than beef, and they're exceptionally nutritious. And most cultures across the world eat insects. Americans don't eat many insects. We think it's gross, but it is a very reliable and sustainable food source for a lot of cultures across the planet. So back to the luna moth. So the female luna moth will lay around 200 eggs in one go. That's the whole point of her existence. She doesn't even have mouth parts to eat food. She just mates and then lays eggs. And so all of those 200 eggs I'm ruining my, okay, let me see if I can. Okay, there we go. Of those 200 eggs, only 3 on average will survive to become an adult moth. And so what happens to the rest of them? They are critical food sources for baby birds and adult birds. So almost all North American birds, 96% of non-shore birds, non-wading birds, they feed their babies exclusively insects, not seeds or berries. And a nest, for example, a nesting pair of chickadees will bring on average per day 300 to 500 caterpillars to their young. So Doug Tallamy's work focuses a lot on caterpillars because they're especially nutritious and especially critical as food for birds. And so when you consider what plants you have in your yard, you have to consider how much caterpillar mass you're providing in order to support birds. You will not be able to support a clutch of baby bluebirds or a clutch of baby chickadees if you don't provide enough food for them. So it's, we used to, I can't tell you how many times a customer would come into the nursery when I worked there with a leaf that had holes in it, and they would say, something's eating my plant, and what should I spray on it, But in reality, that is a good sign. It's a beneficial thing that insects are eating your plants, because it means that your yard is a member of a functioning ecosystem. Your yard and your plants are supporting birds and other wildlife, which in turn supports us. So the National Audubon Society put out a report called Common Birds in Decline, and it shows that some widespread species generally thought to be secure have decreased in numbers as much as 80% since 1967. And then 19 other species in the report have lost half their populations. And this report was from a few years ago. And this is a progressive trend. Bird populations are on a precipitous decline, as well as all sorts of species. And habitat loss is thought to be a main contributing factor. And we can do development differently. We can do human habitation differently. It doesn't have to mean complete loss of habitat. And that is Doug Tallamy's whole message, and his campaign is called Homegrown National Park. And the idea is that our suburbs and our yards and gardens can become like a connected national park, and that we can continue to support our biodiversity in our yards and gardens. Okay, so a diversity of native plants means a diversity of native fauna. It's a direct correlation between how many species of native plants you have and how many species of wildlife, of birds, bees, etc., that you have. So the more biodiverse plant-wise an area is, the more diverse fauna-wise it is. And so plants are just not optional. Each one of them plays a role. And I like to tell people that evolution is an arms race. So like all of these plants and animals co-evolved together with these very complex relationships and interactions. The plants are trying to avoid being eaten and trying to be pollinated and trying to disperse their seeds. And the insects and wildlife are trying to find food, trying to eat plants, trying to get nectar without, having to pollinate a flower, etc. So these interactions are incredibly complex, and they evolved over a long period of time. And so each one of these members of this ecosystem plays an important role. And so the loss of one of these plants or animals has cascading effects that can be unforeseen. So Doug Tallamy uses what he calls the Jenga hypothesis to kind of give us an example of how to kind of think about an ecosystem and how it functions with its species that make it up. So the tower is the ecosystem and the blocks are the species. And so it's not, you can take out species and lose species. There's redundancy in the ecosystem without having the tower fall. But you never know which one will create the eventual collapse of the ecosystem. So with the removal of each species, it puts more weight on the remaining species. And so the loss of each species has cascading effects, and we can't predict it. We don't know where the collapse happens, and it can be sudden, it can be slow, and we're seeing it happen all around of us. So everything is connected. All species play a role. Those roles are relative and constantly changing, and biodiversity is the basis of functioning ecosystems. Though all of those different members are the basis of what makes that ecosystem continue to function. And we need functioning ecosystems. A lot of people think, well, that's fine and dandy, but I'm going to go into my house, close the door, watch TV, eat dinner, and I don't need to think about biodiversity or ecosystem services. But functioning ecosystems are necessary for human life on Earth and also for human quality of life on Earth. And we are seeing the effects of the loss of functioning ecosystems in our quality of life currently. Functioning ecosystems provide what we call ecosystem services, and they're all of these things that are tangible, that are depended upon by us, that are economically important, culturally important, etc. And yet a lot of them we just take for granted and don't even consider. So, pollination is an ecosystem service. Food, meat, plants are ecosystem services. Clean air, the filtration of air, the filtration of water, clean water, decomposition is an ecosystem services. So all of these things can be taken away. Sequestration of carbon, the buffering of extreme weather is one that we definitely are seeing in Florida. The loss of the coastal ecosystems has caused us, the effects of these hurricanes that are continuing to get stronger and larger. We're feeling them even more than we would have if we still had our coastal ecosystems and as intact as they once were. So ecosystem services are incredibly important. We depend upon them, and they are fueled by biodiversity. The more biodiversity, the more ecosystem services we are able to receive. So people might think, well, what about somewhere like this is Manhattan Island, and it's a graphic of what Manhattan looked like compared to what it looks like now. And so many people, especially living in a city, if you grew up there, you might think that plants aren't really necessary to live because you might not even see that many of them. But in reality, Manhattan Island is what we call an ecological sink, which means it is taking resources from other areas around them. So there are ecosystems around New York that are providing all of the services that Manhattan requires. So clean air, clean water, food, pollination, all of those things are being provided by other areas. And so Manhattan is pulling in all the resources, but not replenishing. And there's only so many Manhattans we can have. And if you consider what is happening across the globe, all of the places that have been historically supporting the rest of the world, like the Amazon, for instance, you probably heard when the Amazon was burning that the Amazon is like the Earth's lungs. It's filtering everything. And places all over the world, like we mentioned, everything is connected, have an effect on our quality of life where we are today. So biodiversity is a national treasure that we have abused terribly, partly because we have not understood the consequences of doing so. And biodiversity must be managed just as we manage our water resources, our clean air, and our clean energy. So what can you do? We can plant native. That's a tangible, actionable thing that we can do every day to do our part and to add to biodiversity. So now we move on to what is native. So this is a very controversial in some areas topic. But a lot of people will think, don't plants that have been here for hundreds of years become native because they look so much like our natives? This is Norway maple. It evolved in Europe and was brought here in like the mid 1700s. So it's been here a long time, 300 years. And it looks a lot like our native maples. So doesn't it work? Doesn't this work as a native plant? In reality, it doesn't. It just doesn't. And the reason is because, the lineage that gave way to this maple split off from our native maples, over 80 million years ago when the continents divided. And so that's a very long time of evolution. And so things like what time of year it blooms, all sorts of the chemistry of the exact that make up the leaves, all of these things that have changed and evolved with its indigenous habitat in Europe just don't fit here. And most importantly, our native insects have not evolved to eat it. So despite it being here for 300 years, our native insects still have not had enough time, because 300 years, in evolutionary terms, is a drop in the bucket. So it's just not enough. We have to provide native plants in order to sustain the insects that sustain the rest of our wildlife. And the other reason that non-native plants are problematic is because they are no longer kept in check by all of the things in their environment that they evolved with. All of the plants, the other animals, the fungi and bacteria that evolved with them and kept them kind of in check and balanced in their ecosystem, they have been removed from all of those other members. And so they can often become invasive species that spread unchecked and can outcompete our native species while not providing any food for wildlife and replacing habitat for our wildlife. So non-native plants take is what I wrote, I guess. They use up space and resources like light, water, and nutrients, but they don't pass it up the food chain. They are not functioning members of the ecosystem, no matter how much they might look like our native plants and might look similar, or be really beautiful. They're still just not functioning members of the ecosystems. So I'm going to go through a few invasive plants that I definitely recommend removing if you have them in your yard. These are common invasives in my Leon County region, and you likely see them where you are as well. Bamboo, heavily bamboo Nandina domestica is still sold in lots of garden centers, but the berries are highly toxic to animals as well. And bird deaths have been documented from Nandina berries. Birds like cedar waxwings that gorge on berries they've done autopsies at the University of Georgia on cedar waxwings and found Nandina berries in their bellies. And it's because they have cyanide in them. Coral ardisia, another very common invasive plant in the Tallahassee region. That also has berries that are poisonous to livestock and humans. And both of these species form monocultures in our wooded areas. And so they replace the entire understory in those areas. And so they kill our herbaceous plants like our native wildflowers and grasses that would be down there. And because they are shading out the entire soil surface, because they create an entire carpet, they're preventing the regeneration of the woods as well, because the trees seedlings are shaded out as well. And so eventually, if we don't stay on top of invasive species, we end up with complete monocultures. And I know that you guys have this in your area because I've seen this one all along roadsides. This is a really bad invasive Chinese privet, Ligustrum sinense. Again, there are variegated cultivars that are still sold in nurseries, but this is a listed invasive species, and they can sell these cultivars because they claim that they're sterile, but in reality, no plant is ever truly 100% sterile. They find a way, nature finds a way to reproduce, and they can revert back to their regular selves and spread by seed. So this is another one that prevents the regeneration of forests as well, because it creates such dense thickets. And the same with this species, Ligustrum lucidum, also another bad invasive. So what should you plant? The first thing to do is remove invasives in your yard if you can. Make an effort to do what you can. And invasive trees as well, like camphor and tallow are big ones in the panhandle. Those are real problematic. Mimosa as well. But what can you plant? The first thing you should be guided by is what is growing around you. You want to be not creating South Florida landscapes in North Florida. You want to be recreating the local ecosystems that already occur around you. So natural areas that are well maintained that are around you. I think about Blackwater River State Forest and Eglin Air Force Base. Those are some of the best managed sites in the state of Florida. And they are a great guide to what diversity of species and what kind of what suite of species you should be kind of entering and planting in your yard. So keystone species are species that are critical to the majority of the food web. It's hard to pin down which species are keystone, but there are a few that without them, there would be a noticeable collapse in diversity of birds and wildlife. And those species tend to be ones that are that support a large amount of caterpillar species, the Lepidoptera, which are the moths and butterflies. Again, this is the focus of Doug Tallamy's research. And the most important trees are the mature trees. And so, especially with the hurricanes that we've been seeing hitting the panhandle, Hurricane Michael was just incredibly devastating. People have been preemptively removing mature trees from their yard because they're afraid of trees hitting their house. And that's understandable. I completely get that, but mature trees, especially oaks and pines, are completely irreplaceable. They are supporting so much wildlife, so much bird life. And a mature oak in one neighborhood is a hub for birds in the entire area. So even if your yard is mostly non-native, you might still be getting to see a lot of birds because your neighbors might have some oaks and pines in their yard. But as we continue to remove trees, we lose that. Each mature specimen of an oak and a pine is just invaluable, and you should try to do everything you can to keep them. And so oaks are actually the most important keystone species for Florida birds and wildlife. They support over 900 species of Lepidoptera and 900 species of moths and butterflies. And yet, when you think about an oak, you never think about an oak having holes in its leaves or looking raggedy from, insects eating it. But it's a whole balanced system because they're supporting insects, and those insects are drawing all the wildlife to them to feed on the insect. And they also provide a lot of leaf litter, which is incredibly necessary for soil health and for insects as well. Moths require leaf litter in order to form their cocoons and then metamorphosize. And I always also think about leaf litter when I think about growing up in Tallahassee. I used to see so many fireflies, and now I never see them in town. And fireflies require leaf litter. They need areas with lots of degrading leaves that are breaking down in order to reproduce. So leaf litter is very important. And oaks also provide lots of acorns, which, as you know, are rich in proteins and fats and oils, and incredibly valuable resource for birds and other wildlife. They're also edible for humans as well. You can make flour out of acorns. and, batter up something with acorn flour and fry it. So I'm going to go through a few, important keystone species, and I'll mention different species that are important within those genera. The genus, so all plants and all, humans as well, we have a Latin binomial, which is our genus and our species, and you guys know that from birds. Cardinalis, I think, is cardinal, and we're Homo sapiens, and Quercus is the genus for all of the oaks. So Quercus virginiana is a live oak. That's an incredibly valuable tree. It's very long-lived, and so it supports so much wildlife, so many birds. And I'm sure you guys know that because you see the birds all over them. But there's also the sand live oak, Quercus geminata, white oak, Quercus alba, southern red oak, Quercus falcata, sand post oak, Quercus margarete. And then one of my favorites is the swamp chestnut oak, Quercus moshoii. But we also have a whole lot of other species, but all of these occur in your area and would be great individuals to plant. And so I'm just going to highlight a few within that genus Quercus, or within each genus that I go through. And this is the white oak, Quercus alba, which has this beautiful flaky bark as it ages. It also has gorgeous fall color, and then these lovely big acorns as well. I see this in the ravines along the Apalachicola River, where I spend a lot of time for work. And then pines are the other really important keystone species, and they get a really bad rap because of hurricanes, and we think about pines as being not resistant to wind. But in reality, longleaf pine especially, or any pine that is grown in full sun, tends to be very resistant to wind, but especially longleaf pine. I see the devastation of Hurricane Michael every week because I work out along the Apalachicola River, where it hit really hard. And the planted pines all toppled because they're in an unnatural situation where they shouldn't have been growing so close together. And that can happen in neighborhoods too. And every time, if you have like 3 pines in your yard or 5, if you remove a few of them, you're weakening the entire group, because those trees, that group of trees, all evolved together, and they rely on the buffering of wind from whatever direction of each pine is protecting each other pine, I guess I should say. And when you remove some, you're kind of weakening and exposing the other ones. So that's something to take into consideration. But in the region where Hurricane Michael hit in the Panhandle here, I see lots of beautiful old longleaf that survived without hardly any damage, because they are if they're grown in full sun, they're really resistant. And if they're not too many pines grown too close together, they're very wind resistant. And also longleaf pine ecosystems are incredibly important and covered, a large portion of the Southeast historically, and we have lost them. Less than 1% of longleaf pine, like virgin ecosystems, remain. We have harvested most of them, and the forest that we think of as being a Florida forest is not really what Florida once was or should be. We should have big longleaf pines in our sandhills, and we don't have those anymore. So planting pines is really, really important. They support a lot of Lepidoptera, and they support all kinds of other wildlife and the birds. But there's also the slash pine. One of my favorites is the spruce pine, which gets overlooked, but it's a beautiful specimen plant. Shortleaf pine is really gorgeous, and pond pine's a really neat species as well. And I just wanted to highlight longleaf pine because it is, such a critical part of our southeastern ecosystems, and we have lost the majority of those ecosystems. And so replanting longleaf pine is really critical, but they're also really stunningly beautiful trees. I have a friend who is doing research on pines, and I worked with her coring them for a summer, and ever since she started pointing out the old longleaf to me, I have a new appreciation for them, and they are just stunning. They just have so much character. Their shape and form, each one is unique, and they're just beautiful. And I also included this photo, this historical photo here of what our longleaf pine uplands might have looked like. We would have seen big pines that were fairly far apart, and there would be an understory of herbaceous like plants like grasses and wildflowers. And then we have the native plums and cherries, the prunus species. Alabama black cherry is a really beautiful species that occurs in the Panhandle. Great fall color. The American plum, which is pictured here on the right, that's a beautiful species. All of the cherries are abuzz with bees and pollinating insects in spring. And then they also support Lepidoptera on their leaves as well, which attract the birds. The birds also really love the fruit from these species. There's Chickasaw plum, Prunus angustifolia, which is a small, low-growing tree. Carolina laurel cherry, Prunus caroliniana, Flatwoods plum, Prunus umbellata, and the eastern black cherry, Prunus serratina. This actually has really beautiful panicles of flowers that turn into these lovely fruit, and they have gorgeous fall color as well. And then the hickories are also very important for birds and other wildlife. The mockernut hickory is one of our more common species, and it has incredible fall color. That's the mockernut there on the left. But we also have pignut hickory, water hickory, we have pecans, bitternut hickory, multiple species of hickories, and they're all super valuable to wildlife. In fact, I have a pecan in my yard, and my dogs actually eat the pecans. So valuable to domesticated animals as well, although they're well fed already. And the maples are also really valuable for birds. The southern sugar maple is that's the species here on the right. It's a gorgeous in fall, just a beautiful species. Florida has a lot of fall color, as you guys know, and the maples provide a lot of that. Eastern red maple, Acer rubrum, chalk maple, Acer leucoderm. The eastern box elder, Acer negundo, is an interesting one with compound leaves. Silver maple, Acer saccharum. And the eastern red maple is one that I see a lot over in your area of the Panhandle, and it's just beautiful growing along the rivers out there. In the spring, they have these gorgeous little flowers on the new growth, which are followed by these little seed pods called samaras. And then the fall color is stunning as well. And we have hawthorns, the Crataegus species, incredibly valuable to birds and other wildlife. Parsley haw is one of my favorites. That's parsley haw there on the left. It's really easy to grow. It's a beautiful specimen, and it's called parsley haw because the leaves are very, they're kind of shaped like parsley leaves. That's Crataegus marshallii. Little hip haw is common in the Panhandle, and it's Crataegus fatulata. One flower haw is a really beautiful specimen, a small tree. And most of these Crataegus are pretty small trees as well. Crataegus uniflora, green haw, Crataegus viridi, and beautiful hawthorn in the uplands, Crataegus pulchrima. And parsley haw I wanted to highlight, it's just a beautiful specimen tree. They're not very large, and they have these gorgeous blooms in fall. In spring, all of these hawthorns do, but parsley haw is larval food for the red-spotted purple butterfly. And so those caterpillars are excellent, and the adults are excellent food for birds. And a few other trees I wanted to mention. I can't obviously go over all the trees, but tulip poplar is a beautiful, fast-growing, big tree that has these gorgeous blooms, and it is larval food for the tiger swallowtail butterfly, and those caterpillars support birds as well. And then the hop tree is a native citrus family tree, which has these gorgeous compound umbels of flowers in spring, and then these deciduous compound leaves that fall in the fall. And it is larval food for the giant swallowtail butterfly. And so now I'm moving into some shrubs as well. American holly, the hollies are all excellent plants for birds and wildlife. The berries, but also the amount of insects they support with their blooms. They're prolific bloomers in spring, and then they also support insects on their leaves. And the American holly is one of our hollies that becomes a very large tree, Ilex opaca. And then we have yaupon holly, which is incredibly common, very easy to grow, a great kind of hedge plant in a yard. And the leaves of yaupon are also, if you toast them, you can make them into a tea that has, it's highly caffeinated and tastes a lot like green tea. It's very tasty. And then Carolina holly, Ilex ambigua. The photo on the right is Ilex ambigua, Carolina holly. There's sweet gallberry, Ilex coriaceae. I see that a lot over in the Western Panhandle. Dahoon holly, Ilex cassine, which is also a tree. And possum haw, Ilex decidua, and then many more species. Here, I wanted to highlight American holly, which makes a beautiful big tree, has gorgeous red berries like the rest of our hollies. And I love seeing the cedar waxwings on this species. I mean, cedar waxwings love all of our hollies, but I see them flocking to the American hollies and just denuding the berries from the branches. And viburnums are really important shrubs for birds as well. The maple leaf viburnum, Viburnum aceriifolium, airwood viburnum, Viburnum dentatum, Walter's viburnum, Viburnum ovivatum. That a lot of these grow in a variety of habitats. Walter's viburnum is often seen along the rivers out in your area, blooming in early spring. And rusty black haw, Viburnum rufigulum, and possum haw, which is photographed there on the right. And I actually took that photo on Eglin Air Force Base. And that's a misspelling. It's Viburnum nudum, possum haw. And I wanted to highlight airwood viburnum because they're all really beautiful species, but this one has a gorgeous form. And the berries are the birds fight over those berries. They love them. And if you get too close to like a mockingbird eating at a possum haw, it's going to let you know that you have gotten too close. Because I always try to get photos of these berries because they're this beautiful like blue, gray, black color. But the birds just eat them so quickly. I can rarely get a photo, but I got one there. And of course, these flowers are very, useful for all sorts of pollinating insects as well. And the blueberries are incredibly valuable species of small, middle-sized shrubs for birds. We have Elliott's blueberry in the Panhandle, Vaccinium elliotii. It's a really beautiful species with gorgeous fall color. Darrow's blueberry is one of my favorite, Vaccinium darrowi. Shiny blueberry, Vaccinium mercenites. Sparkleberry, which is photographed here on the right, forms a nice small tree with a gorgeous form. Birds love them. I often see bird nests in sparkleberries too. Rabbit-eye blueberry, Vaccinium virgatum, which is the tasty big ones that everybody grows, but almost all of these actually are all edible. Sparkleberry is not super tasty, but the rest of them, and deerberry is not very tasty, but the rest of them are very tasty. And there are more species than I'm showing here. Darrow's blueberry is one that I wanted to highlight because it's a beautiful landscape plant and it's low growing. You can see on the far right photo, the little shrubs in the front are the Darrow's blueberry. They don't get much taller than knee high. And the new foliage each year has this beautiful glaucous pink, purple, like blue-gray coloration. And the flowers on the left there are really beautiful as well. And there are even bee species that are specialists to blueberry blooms. There's a species called the blueberry bee it only comes out in early spring when the blueberries are blooming, and it only goes to blueberry flowers and is a successful pollinator for them. And then it goes back dormant for most of the year. So besides planting trees and shrubs, which are very important, and protecting your mature trees, one thing you can do, I don't have time to go through all of our perennials and herbs and stuff that are supportive to birds and wildlife, but one thing you can do is try just not mowing an area of your yard for a little while and see what comes up. You have to know what invasive species are in your area though, and what they look like in order to remove those, but you can create what's called a pollinator habitat by often just stopping mowing, and a lot of wildflowers will move in. And this is a little area that was not mowed for a couple years, and we planted a longleaf pine in it and a few native grasses, but otherwise everything else came up naturally. And, you know, you have to go in there and take out some tree seedlings if you don't want it to become all sweet gum or something. And you have to remove invasive, but otherwise you just mow it like once a year, and then you have a little prairie garden. And that's blue mistflower and beggar ticks, the Biden's elbow, which they, you know, might be kind of weedy, but they're a very valuable food for birds and wildlife and the insects that support birds. So these pollinator habitats can also be a great way to interact with kids in the yard, and just planting native in your yard is a great way to raise kids. I feel like it gives them so much stimulation and interest. And even for older people too, my dad had dementia and he lived at home with me for a few years. And I planted a native shrub right outside his bedroom window and put a little suet feeder there. And he got to see all the bees come to the shrub and birds come to the suet feeder. And I feel like nature is a healing and a spiritually fulfilling experience, as I'm sure many of you know. And it can be, I think, critically important at the beginning of life, mid of life, and end of life as well. And so here's just a little inspiration about planting native. This was from a local elementary school here in town, and they didn't have any trees, and they planted some longleaf pine in the 90s there. And then 20 years later, they had these beautiful big longleafs that, you know, longleafs are fairly fast growing. And now they have bluebirds that are nesting there at that elementary school. And so that is a meaningful, you know, tangible result from planting native. You get to see the results, you know, in your lifetime. It's not just like the future generations. You plant a native milkweed or plant a, you know, arrowwood viburnum, and you see those mockingbirds coming in, you see the milkweed monarchs coming to the milkweed. You get to see the fruits of your labor. And so again, I wanted to say that we have become important players in the management of our nation's wildlife. What you choose to pull or plant in your yard affects the biodiversity of your yard, town, and planet. And we need to do what we can. That's it. Should I stop sharing or?
Thank you, Lily. Any questions? I think you'll take questions, won't you?
Yeah, I'm happy to take questions.
Our native plant.
A different kind of sweet gum that is non-fruiting was developed by a professor in North Carolina. Even though it won't give you any fruit, most of the benefit is from the leaves. Have the leaves been modified so that it's not as attractive and beneficial for the insects that would normally lay eggs and for that?
Yeah, you've touched on a hot topic in the native plant world, and we call those nativars. They're like cultivated varieties of native plants. So it's a mashup of native and cultivar. But what happens when we start breeding essentially plants is it has, you know, it might have unforeseen effects to the chemistry of the leaves and the time of the blooms, the time of the fruit seed set. It is inevitably not going to play as important of a role in the ecosystem as it would if it were a straight seed grown native plant. So it's best to choose natives that are just straight natives that are grown from seed and grown from local seed stock. So, you know, things like Acer rubrum, the red maple, grows very far north. And if you bought a plant, you know, from Home Depot of a red maple, it probably came from seed stock from a red maple up north or in the Midwest. and not our native stock. And so that tree is probably never going to do as well as it would if it were a straight Florida, ecotype, it's called. And it might not be as beneficial to our wildlife because of that, because those big differences in regions have, differences in leaf chemistry and other things. So it's always best to just go with straight native.
Thank you.
Guardian Alba, a native?
That is not, there is not consensus on that. It is likely introduced like, pre European colonization, but didn't evolve here. So it does play a role. I would say it has become an important plant, and it does, because it's so weedy and will bloom anywhere, it does provide a lot of pollen and nectar where a lot of, other things wouldn't. So, but technically it's not the best, and it is rather annoying with the little stickers that stick to you, but it is providing services. It's one of the best pollinator plants in Florida because it blooms year round and nonstop.
What is the name of the plant?
Biden's alba, commonly known as beggar ticks.
I have a question.
Mhm.
I have a question. What is your opinion of lantana?
Well, lantana is invasive in Florida. There are native species of lantana. They're not as problematic of an invasive in North Florida as they are in Central and South Florida. But nonetheless, with climate change, and I do see them spreading in natural areas, especially coastal areas in Florida. So I think that you would be better served to plant native plants, because those lantanas, while the flowers may be providing nectar, the leaves are not providing anything for our native insects. And so you could be planting something like a native lantana or another native plant that provides the nectar, but also provides the leaves as a larval food host for a variety of caterpillars and other insects. And that way you're actually really supporting the ecosystem by providing, a functioning member of the ecosystem.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Just a comment, it's that they're not easy to sort. Don't have many native plants. Firstly, not easy to sort these.
Or we do better as a club to say we want to get some certain things and get them from a nursery.
Yeah, and you could work together with your local chapter of the Native Plant Society, because they likely, have connections with native plant growers in the area, and there are some out there. And they also might be having plant sales as well. Like a lot of our chapters have regular annual plant sales. But the sourcing native plants has been an issue, because a lot of people are realizing that they need to plant native and they want to plant native, and the supply is not meeting the demand. Essentially, the demand is growing exponentially, and there's just not enough supply. And growers, it takes them a while to, there's a learning curve with growing each new species, and they have to figure out how to grow it successfully and profitably. And so there is a lag right now. But there are native plant growers in your area, and there are several here in Leon County and Madison County as well. So there are resources, and there is also a native plant nursery in the Panhandle here that sells online. It's called Mail Order Natives, and you can purchase plants online and have them delivered to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to mention that Emily Peterson, who used to own the Garden Gate that was over here in Gulf Breeze, Emily, I think, makes regular trips over to Tallahassee to buy from a native plant nursery over there. And I think that she still will take orders when she's going to go. And so you would get in touch with Emily. That would be one source that I know of. I know that Dara Dobson, who was in Defuniak, sold her nursery there. What was the name of it? Three Pines, I think.
Yeah.
At any rate, do you know if another native plant person bought that, or was it?
I don't know that another native plant person bought that, but I know that the longleaf pine chapter has a person who is growing native plants now and starting a nursery. And I can't remember her name. I want to say it's Ashley, but I could be, I'm terrible with human names. But I would definitely check that out. I know I follow her on Instagram. She's on Instagram.
This is Kimberly. Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
Ashley Moore and Gina just opened Native Plant Company. It's up in Milton, and they have a website and an inventory list if you want to go on there, nativeplantcompany.com. So I just wanted to mention that. That's our only native.
That's who I was thinking of. And they're
Mhm.
doing an excellent job. They have started growing some really wonderful species. I've been really impressed with what they're doing. So I definitely recommend supporting them. And that's nativeplantcompany.com.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Okay. No more questions? Thank you so much, Lily.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I'm gonna go get up in the morning and hack down my lantana.
Okay. Yeah, I know it's painful sometimes because you see butterflies on it, you see things using it. You have to consider the greater whole.
Oh, we really enjoy it. Yeah.
I have one more question for you.
Sure.
What do you think about the 70-30 rule that Doug Tallamy?
Oh yeah, I don't think it's not always feasible. Or a lot of people aren't capable of maintaining a completely native yard. So the goal should always be, and I also know that it's easy for people to be overwhelmed if they see their yard and it's all non-native. The goal should just be increasing the percentage of natives in your yard every year. Plant a native tree if you don't already have one. Protect your native trees. Remove invasives if you can, and then just do what you can each year to increase the percentage of natives in your yard. And there are lots of plants that, some people, like I have non-native orchids. I like orchids. So, they bring me joy, and I don't grow any species that are invasive. There are even invasive orchids in reality, but I just am careful about what species I grow, and I grow those because I enjoy them. And I think there's nothing wrong with that.
There you go. Okay. Thank you so much, Lily.
Yeah, thank you. I will stop sharing.
Knowing that you're an hour ahead of us, we'll let you go.